let's take a look at Christianity and Beowulf. Many people believe that Beowulf is actually a Christian story, when in fact it is not. Beowulf is actually a Germanic tale that was written down around 1000 AD, but it tells of a time roughly between 400 and 600 AD. At that time, the Germanic tribes were considered pagan, and we see this as evidenced by such things as cremation, evidenced by Shield's cremation and Beowulf's cremation at the end, and we have references to these old stone gods. So why all the Christianity in Beowulf if this is telling of a pagan tale? Probably because of the infiltration of the church. If you remember, based on your history lessons, the church was actually spreading. It spread up to England in the medieval period, and at that time, the monks were the keepers of knowledge. The monks were the keepers of the texts. So what probably happened, scholars suppose, is that this oral story, Beowulf, so enthralled people. It was such an interesting story, but in order to preserve it, in order to keep it in its written form, it had to have some level of Christianity. It had some level of a biblical feel to it. So we find biblical references throughout Beowulf. We find God gives Beowulf his strength. We find King Hrothgar praising God, Beowulf praising God. And then we find some other very specific references. For example, we see Grendel. Grendel actually is the spawn of Cain and from Cain's lineage. This is in lines 100 through 114. It says here that Grendel haunted the moors, the wild marshes, and made his home in hell. Not hell, but earth. He was spawned in that slime, conceived by a pair of those monsters born of Cain, murderous creatures, banished by God, punished forever for the crime of Abel's death. So not only do we have this horrible monster, this scary monster that lives in the marshes, that prowls around in the darkness at the edge of the firelight, but we have this monster that is also associated with Cain, Cain being the first murderer, so that gives Grendel a much more sinister feel to him. We also see a reference to the Tower of Babel, and I know many people miss this, but we find it in Hrothgar's building of Heorot, lines 64 through 85, and I'm going to read the middle of those lines. It says that Hrothgar resolved to build a hall that would hold his mighty band and reach higher toward heaven than anything that had ever been known to the sons of men. So this idea that Hrothgar wants to build this tall and mighty tower, we know that Babel displeased God of the Old Testament, and so we wonder if maybe Grendel here was acting as an agent of God's wrath, because Grendel is actually introduced right after this idea of Heorot being built, this tower that reaches higher toward heaven. So perhaps Grendel was the agent of God's wrath to bring judgment and punishment on the Danes for building such a structure. Grendel is also the recipient, we see, of God's wrath because he is of the lineage of Cain. We also see a reference to the creation story, lines 90 through 98. This portion of the text is actually called the Song of Creation. And here we have the poets singing out their songs. They sung the ancient beginnings of us all, recalling the Almighty making the earth, shaping these beautiful plains marked off by oceans, then proudly setting the sun and moon to glow across the land and light it. The corners of the earth were made lovely with trees and leaves made quick with life, and each of these nations who now move on its face. So we see this progression, this creative progression taking place much of like what we find in Genesis. Lastly, the one other aspect I would like to look at is there is definitely a clear parallel between Hrothgar and King Saul of the biblical text and Beowulf and King David. Hrothgar, we see in line 170, Hrothgar's heart was bent. You know, like King Saul consulted the Witch of Endor, we have Hrothgar consulting these stone gods, these heathen gods. We find that in the second chapter of Beowulf. David, however, replaces Beowulf. This is how tightly they're aligned. Beowulf replaces Hrothgar as the Danes' protector. So that just like King Saul could not stand and represent his people and protect his people anymore, and King David took over, here we see Hrothgar cannot protect his people against his monster problem, and Beowulf comes in and replaces this king in his protection services. So Beowulf, just in a nutshell, Beowulf was preserved by the monks. And that's probably why we still have it today, because it was kept alive. This oral tradition was kept alive because it was indeed layered with Christianity.